Tá fáilte ráh chuirdeach ag agránimhníé de Blúiríní Béaloidis podchéile de chuid cnúsach feidir is éan a bhfuil a tíocht tugad ó chríleir le chartanda and ag gláistin Hullscoile baile á clia. Hello friends, you're very welcome along to the 19th edition of Folklore Fragments, coming to you from the heart of the archive here at the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin, with myself, Jonny Dillon, and my friend and colleague and partner in crime here, Claire, for the sake of completeness, Doohan. That's you, Claire. Hello, Claire.
Me. Hello, Jonny.
How you doing, Claire? Doohan?
I cannot complain.
Do people ever say it to you? How you doing, Claire? Doohan?
Actually, no, you're probably the first person who's actually rhymed it like that. I don't like it.
Well, that's that. So today we're going to leave the cares of the town behind us and travel to the shelter of the green wood. Amidst the oak and the ash, the hazel and the alder, the rowan and the blackthorn, the apple tree, the yew and the bramble will we make our course, as today we explore customs and practices concerning sacred trees in folk tradition. While rooted in the earth, trees ascend towards the firmament of the heavens. They likewise renew themselves through the eternal rhythms that govern all living things, those cycles of growth, maturation, decay, and rebirth, as they blossom, flower, give fruit, and eventually shed their leaves before being reborn anew each spring. Certain of these proud intermediaries between heaven and earth were treated with great veneration by our forebears, and it is on these trees that we will focus our attention today. So stay with us as we consider our culture born of nature. From sacred trees under which kings of Ireland were inaugurated in times long ago, to the holy woods inhabited by both madmen and saints, sometimes one and the same. From votive offerings left hanging on the branches of trees growing beside holy wells, to those trees treated with fear and trepidation, understood as they were as dwellings of the otherworld spirits which live alongside us in the natural landscape. Trees.
Trees, that's a thing of beauty there, Jonny.
Well, thanks, Claire. Arts degree. I've been haranguing poor Claire about this topic for a while now, haven't I?
For months you've
I don't even know why.
trees.
I don't even have a big thing about trees, but I just thought
It really has been something you've been interested in for quite a while.
it has.
And we've put it off, but finally you've worn me down.
I have. Excellent. Okay, to start, maybe we'll have a piece from Daithí O'Hogan.
Lovely.
Which is lovely. This is the late Professor Daithí O'Hogan, a hugely inspiring figure. His lectures were incredible. When I started studying here years ago, he was a huge inspiration to carry on working in folk tradition. Published the Sacred Isle, Unfilla, the Lore of Ireland, the encyclopedia that we often point people towards, countless books of poetry, all sorts of amazing character. This is him appearing on Radio 1, I think, in the 1990s, and he's talking about trees, and he'll go on to describe the billa, the sacred tree that will then lead us into the early laws and stuff like that.
Excellent.
So here's Daithí.
Today's guest is Professor Daithí O'Hogan of the Department of Irish Folklore at UCD.
Being so strong and so beautiful, trees have always excited the human imagination. Many ancient cultures saw the tree, which grows from the ground to the sky, as a sacred part of the landscape which connects heaven with earth. And the mythologies of various peoples speak of a huge tree on which the order of the whole universe depends. In early Irish Christianity, God was sometimes described as the great architect of the firmament, who built the house of the world around 4 massive tree posts. Something of this symbolism survives in spoken Irish still, when we say that to give fulsome praise to a person is to praise him or her go crannan na spéire, that is, to the trees of the sky. There's frequent mention of famous old trees, and these in fact seem to have been landmarks for public assemblies. Most celebrated of them was the Billitartan at Ardbracken in County Meath, said to have been an ash of gigantic size under which a whole clan could shelter from rain and storms. Others were the yew tree of Moon near Ballymoon in County Kildare, the yew of Ross at Old Loughlin in County Carlow, an ash called Daithí's Branch at Farbill in County Westmeath, and another ash called the Branch of Ishnach in the same county. The sites of many of the great trees were taken over by monastic communities, and there are several mentions of such in the lives of the saints. The belief long survived that a very old and notable tree, termed a billa, was sacred, especially if it were in a cemetery or near a holy well. Many accounts tell of misfortune befalling people who interfered with such a reverend old tree or cut it down.
All right, Daithí O'Hogan. Into your grass there. It's really nice to hear him speaking.
It's quite nice to hear a voice again when you haven't heard it for a while, isn't it?
It is. So he mentioned a couple of things there. I suppose the idea of the sacred tree, the trees that hold up the world, the pillars of the 4 pillars upon which the entirety of the world rests. God or the great creator of the universe building the house of the world on 4 tree posts and praising people, go crown the spirit to the trees of the sky and stuff like that. Should we look at the billa?
Yes,
The idea of the
sacred tree.
sacred tree. You were mentioning there were 5 trees or something like that.
There were, we actually had a wonderful article. A.T. Lucas writes about the 5 great legendary trees of Ireland, and he names them as Billa Torton, O Mugna, O Rotha, Crave Dahi, Billa Ushnig, which were mentioned by Dahi there in his recording. And the word Billa that Dahi mentioned earlier, this seems to be the Irish word that it would have been used traditionally to denote a sacred tree,
in
or they might
particular.
have used the word creve as well. A.T. Lucas says that they were interchangeable. But whenever you see the word billa or even bell or bellu as a root in a word, you might just remember this podcast and wonder, oh, is this the site of a sacred tree, or was it once? Because that's often what A.T. Lucas associates
And
it
it's
with.
where we get the term of the Irish language word for a page, a relief, billog.
true.
Same root,
Exactly.
but it appears in different place names.
It does, and actually, if you see, he has a few examples. So, Ohavilla in Cavan, Ahavili in Armagh and Down, or Ballinvilla in Mayo. Again, anytime you see this word and this root, if you pardon the pun, that's what we're talking about. That potentially there could have been a sacred tree there once.
I suppose what he's mentioned essentially is the widespread is a derivation that these when he talks about you mentioned Ahavilla, the field of the tree and so on, that these places are found in counties Antrim, Sligo, Cavan, Leitrim, Monaghan, Cork, Down, Mayo, Roscommon, Tip, Waterford, Galway, Tyrone, etc., etc. That
All
there's
over.
such a wide derivation that it would suggest it to be a particularly old practice, old ideas basically. But again, yeah, I suppose an interesting aspect of the idea of the sacred tree.
It is, but he has, if I can read out here, he has an example from Tipperary where he says, in 1834, there was still growing in Tombracane in Borrisacane parish, County Tipperary, a large ash 22 feet in circumference at the base, which O'Donovan says was called Bellow Tree in English. Another account of this tree states that it was called the Big Bell Tree, and goes on to record the local belief that if any part of it were used for fuel, the house in which it was burnt would itself be destroyed by fire, and that the water which lodged in a hollow between the branches was regarded as holy. Whether called Bellow Tree or Bell Tree, there can be no doubt that these are versions of the Irish Billa, and a sketch published with the second account shows it as according with Keaton's definition of a Billa, which was a large tree standing in a plain or open space. So it comes with great lore and great history and great reverence in many communities.
Was this the one, or is it literally made a note where he goes to it himself and sees that it's fallen down and is rotten, but people are still leaving offerings in its trunk?
That was A.T. Lucas, but I don't know if it's that
It might have
one
been
in
another country
Tipperary.
later, but the idea as well that you see of the that motif, the idea that if you strike this tree down, if you take fuel from it, if you cut it down, that your house will be destroyed by fire. There's a reference to that in relation with the ash, I think, in the folklore collection here, where a man is out in the field, he goes to cut a tree on his land so that he can increase more arable land. That's something that we'll look at and listen to again later. And on going to cut it down, he looks back towards his house, which he sees is totally on fire, and he freaks out and runs back home. And when he gets there, it's not on fire. Goes back to the tree, begins cutting it, hacking and slashing and so on, looks back, house on fire, runs back, not on fire, runs back to the field, hacks the tree, sees house is on fire, ignores it, cuts the tree down, goes back, house is burnt down.
Yes.
So this is the kind of the retribution, which is a theme that will I suppose appear in many instances as we go on looking at this. The idea of a retribution that's brought against an individual who desecrates a sacred tree, which is something that even maintains itself today. People won't cut trees on land. Roads have been diverted.
We've
Main
discussed
roads.
this before, in relation to
Fairy forts and trees.
fairy rats,
But I suppose the idea from ancient times of a sacred tree, the billa, the large, huge tree that stands on its own in a field, or that kind of marks a particular sacred site, is of particular antiquity, I suppose.
Yes, very true.
That we see in place names and so on. Inauguration sites for kings, A.T. Lucas mentions as well. That there were these in ancient Ireland up to the late medieval or the 16th century really, that the place where the ancient kings of the different tribes, because of course Ireland wasn't a unified nation at that stage, it was, I suppose, an island of shifting allegiances, of tribal alliances and kings and so on.
Chiefs and tribes all over.
All over the place.
Clans.
And so the kings, the great kings of Ireland, were inaugurated often at these sites by these huge trees, but at a billa. And that the enemies then often, if you were kind of ransacking your arch nemesis and so on, one of the things you do would be to hack down the inauguration tree or the billa, the sacred tree, as a kind of a mocking insult, I suppose, to those people. There are numerous kind of references to that.
In 1129, the Munster men, led by McCarthy and O'Brien, advanced into Connacht, where they levelled the Ruivehe, which was the red birch, a significant billa in that area for the inauguration of their kings and their chieftains. And we see the O'Neills, the great O'Neills of Tyrone.
Yes, huge family.
In Dungannon, County Tyrone, they would have had their, I think it was an ash tree in Tullahogue, somewhere there near Dungannon, where they were inaugurated in centuries gone by. So fascinating that you can actually point to, if it's still not there, but at least a location where a sacred tree once stood for this purpose.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I was thinking about it. I'd love to find some of the ones that are mentioned to see if they still remain, and I don't know, go there and look at them in terror. So I suppose from early Ireland and then the arrival of kind of Christian tradition, it seems that in early Christian Ireland, a great many what are now understood and revered as holy places, either monasteries or churches or holy wells and so on, often have a sacred tree or large tree growing near them or attached to them in some way. So the idea of kind of sacred groves and ecclesiastical sites and so on are common. Actually, on the topic of sacred groves, to go back to the pagan stuff for a minute, there's an amazing piece. There's a lovely little book by Christine Zucchelli. Zucchelli?
I think it's Zucchelli.
Zucchelli, our resident Italian expert, who did her thesis here on sacred trees, and then published a lovely book called Sacred Trees of Ireland.
And she's a lovely one on stones as well.
On stones, Sacred Stones of Ireland.
That'll be our next podcast.
Yes, exactly, yeah. It's a beautiful book, and it has lots of kind of lovely pictures, photographs, and then accounts from early literature and the manuscripts here and so on and so forth.
It's actually lovely to include the photographs, because even just looking at them there, you just realise the sheer beauty of trees that you just don't take time to appreciate.
But there's a piece here which I was struck by. This is I should have mentioned this at the start. It's
a dog ear.
Oh, sorry, a dog ear. Look, I dog ear my pages.
Go on.
I love my books. I scribble on them. I dog ear them. God. So this is back to go to the kind of Celtic stuff, but just this idea of sacred groves, of sacred woods in general, which we'll look at then in a kind of Christian sense. But before the Christian stuff, I just thought this was a fantastic and kind of hyperbolic and amazing description. This is Caesar's troops as they're marching through southern Gaul, and they come across a Celtic sacred grove near Marseille, and it says, "A grove there was, never profaned since time remote, enclosing with its intertwining branches the dingy air and chilly shadows, banishing sunlight far above. In this grove there are altars furnished with hideous offerings, and every tree is sanctified with human blood. The birds fear to sit upon those branches, the beasts fear to lie in those thickets. On the woods no wind has borne down, nor thunderbolts shot from black clouds. Though the trees present their leaves to no breeze, they have a trembling of their own. Water pours from black springs, and the grim and artless images of gods stand as shapeless fallen tree trunks. Now it was rumoured that often the hollow caves below rumbled with earthquakes, that yew trees fell and rose again, that flames shot from trees which were not on fire, that snakes embraced and flowed around the trunks." Amazing piece. Let's go there. But that's the kind of pre-Christian, the idea of a sacred grove, the idea of open air worship in the woods or in a clearing in the woods or under a sacred tree at a clearing or whatever.
That these existed before the coming of Christianity.
Exactly. But then we have references all over the early literature in the Christian sense, but all of our early literature is kind of framed through the lens of Christian tradition, early Christian tradition. But the idea that I suppose there are sacred trees at ecclesiastical sites. So we're told, for example, in the 8th century Book of Armagh, St. Patrick founded a church near the Billa Tartan that you mentioned earlier, Claire. And there are references to sacred groves and sacred woods near the monastic town of Armagh. That we hear that in 995 AD that it was set on fire by lightning, and that along with the town, the sacred wood that was burned. Also, then there's references to Saint Kevin, who compiled or constructed Glendalough, monastic settlement in Glendalough. And in West Wicklow there's the town of Hollywood, which has an interesting story to it. But I think in the 12th century there are references to Sanctum Boscus, meaning holy wood. And the holy wood is attached to St. Kevin. His devotees are marching him around, they're burying him aloft on a platform, as you do.
You like the sound of that.
Look, I'm just saying.
Just putting it out there.
I'm just putting it out there. It's just an idea. He's being borne aloft by his devotees. Here is the saint, the good saint, is being. He's kind of go over there and travel this way, and he points his devotees towards a wood. And like, we can't walk through the wood. It's a wood. And he says, don't worry about it. Just keep going. And as he walks through the wood, he begins to pray fervently and make these kind of pronouncements and so on. And the trees all begin to bend and fall over in front of them, and a path is cut through. Oh. So they march through
like
the wood.
Moses and the Red Sea.
No.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Well, in a sense, there's a parting being made through the natural world, an obstacle, whatever, and it's through supernatural or divine intervention that this occurs. And so Saint Kevin then says, the place is named Sanctum Boscus, and he declares that he gives, what does he say? Hell and short life to anyone that would burn green wood or dry from this wood for all eternity. If you touch it, if you burn it, you're going to die, and then you're going to go to hell. That was his approach. So the idea, I suppose, of early saints putting prohibitions on the interference with these sacred groves and so on.
Because we have St. Columkill in Derry.
Very interesting.
Is massive on this front, because he was particularly fond of this area in Derry where he believed that to have more angels than leaves on a particular tree, that kind of anew that he called the yew of the saints.
Amazing.
And he has some, again, just kind of referencing A.T. Lucas, if I can find it here.
Hurry up.
Where is this now? 28. Oh. Yes, so St. Columkill's Oakwood, after the famous saint who founded a monastery there in the 6th century in Derry. And he was so fond of it that he once wrote, when he was being exiled to Scotland, "Though I am affrighted truly by death and by hell, I am more affrighted, frankly, by the sound of an axe in Derry in the west."
Oh, that was that quote. I didn't
lovely.
get that. That's what he's saying. Yeah. Yes, right.
Just not to, again, like St. Kevin, that no man, woman should ever
interfere
with this grove or these trees.
And didn't he invoke a prayer to protect the wood against fire, or against? And
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah,
A.T. Lucas he suggests, he wonders if there was an echo of some kind of pre-Christian tradition of the exorcism of a wood, basically, that there was a kind of, he sings a song at the trees to either exorcise a demon or protect it from fires or something like that. I can't quite recall. But it was the yew tree in particular that Columkill mentioned? He
did. He actually mentioned, you see, the yew of the saints, if I've got it correctly. And he writes, "This is the yew of the saints, where they used to come with me together. 100 angels were there, above our heads, side close to side. Dear to me is that yew tree. Would that I were set in its place there. On my left it was pleasant adornment when I entered into the black church."
Amazing.
Beautiful.
Really the yew tree is an interesting one, and there's a quote here from Dralis Cambrensis. He talks about the yew tree, and he says, of Ireland at that time, "Yews with their bitter sap are more frequently to be found in this country than in any other I have visited, but you will see them principally in old cemeteries and sacred places, where they were planted in ancient times by the hands of holy men to give them what ornament and beauty they could." He also tells us then that several troops of archers were quartered at the town of Finglas in County Dublin, where he says, "The illustrious Abbot Kenneth and other holy men in succession, through whose fervent piety the place became celebrated, had formerly planted with their own hands ash trees and yews, and various other kinds of trees round the cemetery for the ornament of the church. The soldiers, being short of fuel, cut down these trees, but in retribution for their impiety they were smitten by a sudden and singular pestilence, so that most of them perished miserably within a few days." Nice. Miserable
that's the way to go.
That's the way to go. But the idea of the yew tree, I was looking at this a bit yesterday, and the yew tree can grow for thousands and thousands of years. Apparently there are no extremely ancient yew trees in Ireland. It's thought that there are some instances that are maybe up to 800 years old, which is old. But there's the Bedhampton yew near Portsmouth in the south of England, and that's approximately 1,000 years old. But the absolute king yew,
coming out on top,
is the Fortingal yew. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fortingal, in Scotland, which is approximately 2,000 or 3,000 years old.
Imagine.
And it's grown out of a little church. I was down in Muckross Abbey in Killarney a couple of summers ago, a fantastic abbey. Google yew tree, Muckross Abbey, Muckross, and growing in the courtyard of this beautiful abbey. The abbey itself was built in the 1400s. Is an enormous yew tree. It's beautiful. It's an amazing place. But it was thought initially that yew tree was planted in the courtyard, but now it seems that it was the other way around. And there's another ancient yew tree which might be the oldest in the country, I think, growing outside the monastery, outside the abbey. But it's thought that the abbey was built around these trees. It wasn't.
The church came to the tree.
The church came to the sacred place. Yeah, and it's something we see again and again and again, that there's an overlay of kind of the new ideology is coming, and that the new kind of ways are mapping over the old ones. You know.
There's a lovely line here actually that explains it really well. If we have time, should I jump into it?
No, we don't have time. Now let's move on. Yes, of course.
So if we where are we? If we accept the statement about the foundation of a church at the Billitorton and the suggestion that Armagh, Derry, Kildare and Clonmacnoise, about which we've been speaking, were originally pagan seats of sacred groves or trees, then we must visualise the association as beginning in a deliberate effort by the church to Christianise these pagan sanctuaries by attaching them to the Christian ritual while yielding to the traditional pagan devotion to them. At first, in brief, the church came to the tree, not the tree to the church, exactly as Jonny was saying.
Great. Sorry, it's just lovely. It's a lovely
piece.
It
just kind of says it quite concisely, doesn't it? So at first, in brief, the church came to the tree, not the tree to the church. The more this strategy was put into practice, the firmer the association between the church and the tree grew, until in time, by force of it, the trees came to the churches and the planting of them there was rationalised, as Cambrensis, who we mentioned, rationalises it into a matter of beauty and adornment. The holiness, however, of the ancestral billa surviving, altered in kind but not in degree. So it's really interesting that, as he said, the church came to the tree, not the other way around, as we might imagine.
Yes. And the yew tree in particular, and its connection with the church, there's a couple of references in the early literature that we can look at. I was going to mention one of my favourite texts of all time ever, Bulla Sibna, The Frenzy of Sweeney.
Oh, you love The Frenzy of Sweeney.
It's one of my favourites, and people should read it out there. It's about it's a king, a tribal king, who was cursed by a saint, and he goes mad in battle, and he flees. He runs across the tops of the spears of the battle hosts, all nimbly, kind of, and turns into this weird kind of bird. He's naked as the day he was born, and he flees off into the woods in like a total madman, where he begins composing amazing nature poetry. He gets this gift of art and poetry and insight and so on.
And travels across the country.
Travels all over the country.
He appears everywhere.
So
Donegal, Kerry, you name it.
If he's kind of up a tree naked composing these poems in a state of horror, and then somebody will walk in the wood nearby and break a twig, and it sends his mind into such a frenzy that he'll fly to Donegal all of a sudden, and then the same thing will happen, and he has no peace, and he goes to the Valley of the Mad in Kerry. There's interesting there's some interesting scholarship on the idea that Sibna is similarly related to the figure of Merlin, the crazy madman, and also of Odin, and the idea of the threefold death that's prophesied by the figure of this Indo-European kind of there's a commonality between these figures. Merlin, Lilican was a Welsh madman as well, I think, Odin and Sibna, that they have these kind of overlays. But
all these madmen.
In the woods.
Honest to God.
What are they going to do?
Women just rolling their eyes down below.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, getting on with it. But there's a section here of
I'm sorry, I can't let it pass. There is a feather now marking your book, Jonny, as opposed to a dog ear.
This is it. Well, it's a bookmark. This is a magpie feather. Yes. Well, and there's a dog ears.
And there's a dog ear. Okay.
So I'll try to
tune in next month, folks, to see what the next installment will be.
Bits of bones. Yep. Oh God. It's an auspicious feather. I have a few of them. When I find them, I use them as bookmarks.
You're a big fan of magpies, Jonny.
I am. So, this is Sibna, and this is where he goes nuts, basically. It says, now, when Sibna heard these great cries, together with their sounds and reverberations in the clouds of heaven and in the vault of the firmament, he looked up, whereupon turbulence and darkness and fury and giddiness and frenzy and flight, unsteadiness, restlessness and unquiet filled him, likewise disgust with every place in which he used to be, and desire for every place which he had not reached. His fingers were palsied, his feet trembled, and his heart beat quick. His senses were overcome, his sight was distorted, his weapons fell naked from his hands, so that through Ronan's curse he went like any bird of the air in madness and imbecility. Now, however, when he arrived out of battle, it was seldom that his feet would touch the ground because of the swiftness of his course, and when he did touch it, it would not shake the dew from the top of the grass, nor the lightness and nimbleness of his step. He halted not from that headlong course until he left neither plain nor field, nor bare mountain, nor bog, nor thicket, nor marsh, nor hill, nor hollow, nor dense sheltering wood in Ireland, that he did not travel that day, until he reached Rusbarrick in Glenarkin, where he went into the yew tree that was in the glen. He goes into the yew tree, okay, and then, so these people close around him at the bottom of the tree, and well, he doesn't like this at all, basically. And he says, when the men heard Sivna reciting the verses, they recognised him and urged him to trust them. He said that he would never do so. He gets intensely paranoid. Then, as they were closing round the tree, Sivna rose out of it very lightly and nimbly and went to Kilreagan in Tirchunnell, where he perched on the old tree of the church. That's what A.T. Lucas mentions in his text, that it's the old tree of the church that kind of this idea of the billet that's by the church is a kind of a common thing, basically, and just to tie in with that idea of the tree, that the church that comes to the tree, not the other way around, basically, of these sacred sites and holy points. In Christian tradition as well, just to throw another bit of audio into this this segment or whatever, there was association in Christian tradition of the alder tree in Irish folk tradition. It was an unlucky tree. You shouldn't pass it. You shouldn't burn it. You shouldn't use it for anything, because Judas hanged himself from that tree.
Yes.
And we have a recording here from Michael Walsh, and he has lovely tape recordings with Jim Delaney. And Michael Walsh is from Offaly, and he describes how this tree was unlucky, basically, and that this is the one from which Judas hanged himself. So we'll hear this now.
The elder tree.
Yeah, the old elder.
Yeah.
But there was a bad year.
What did you say? What did you say about it?
About which?
The elder tree.
ELDER, isn't that here?
What about it? I didn't.
He was.
I didn't.
Judas hung himself over one.
Let's see.
But there was.
Why is it so common then around the gardens, around the house?
Oh, sure, it would grow nearly on the road if it fell.
Yeah.
I think it would nearly grow up with cement. And you can't burn it. No one had burned it.
Is that so?
They say it's not lucky and cattle would die and everything. But anyway, whoever has seen it, they have it about Judas hanging himself. And as a tree is not liked, although there's nice elderberries on it, could make nice berry. But
you're not supposed to burn it.
no.
A big bad luck.
I told her cattle would die or something. But anyway, it's no good to burn, which is only like old dirt in a way.
Just hang himself from it, just don't do him with it. But he also then describes, in this instance, this guy Ned Halligan, who was a big character around the area, who, well, let make himself describe this, but he decides, well, he does want to take it down, he does want to burn it, and somebody gives out to him, but he has a very particular reply to them, basically.
Okay.
There was a grey old character by the name of Ned Halligan, and he was the night watchman in Rosgrey baking factory. But Ned was a well-up old deeple, but could talk to anyone, and must have got a good school, but was terribly intelligent. But Ned went on towards Birch's Bog. But he took a saw, one man saw with him, and a bill hoe. He said he'd get mains of a fire over some of them. But sure, he went on to the turf, and sure, there's only a heap of muck, but came back, but there was great big elder trees growing alongside the bog road and on the old ditch. Lots of them, the finest. We got Ned picked out one. Well, he got hard with the saw, and he began sawing. Well, then there was others came on, and they said, to look for it, so I would get a lock of turf too, and they said, "What are you doing, Ned? Don't you see what I'm doing? I'm sawing down this tree." "And why are you sawing for? To cut it up and take it home and burn it." "But they say it's not right to burn an elder tree." "Why?" says Ned. "They said it was over an elder that Judas hung himself." "Well, big ups," says Ned, "he didn't hang himself over this one, and he sawed away. He didn't, it wasn't this one, and sawed it down, took home a great big load of elder to Bunker's Hill, and carried it in and burnt. Well,
That's a good answer he gave them.
and big gubs, and Ned would have no place for anything like that.
So that was Ned. He wasn't having any of that.
I love the Irish sense of humour there. They've all
Good.
got a reply.
He didn't hang himself out of this one. So I suppose, the idea that the Christian tradition, I guess, that overlays over the sacred, sacred pre-Christian spaces and things is something that cannot be, I don't know, understated or avoided at all. And there's a continuity of veneration and worship and so on through those sites and into the living tradition today. Speaking of which, I suppose it would make sense to move on to the idea of holy wells.
Yes, because we do see them emerge again and again in that tradition, don't we?
And just for the benefit maybe of anyone who, I suppose, isn't aware, there are considered to be over 3,000 holy wells in Ireland, and there's a cult towards them which is well attested in folk tradition and the early literature and so on. Almost every saint who comes to us is attributed with kind of miraculously.
I thought you mentioned the archive.
Comes into us,
Yes.
exactly, visits us. But any saint who's made mention of, that there's generally some miracle through which they kind of create a holy well, basically. But what's often considered as an essential kind of component or part to it is the idea that beside these holy wells grows a bush or a tree which is also venerated. It kind of partakes in the sanctity of the well, basically. And a very common thing that you see in this regard is the idea that, or the not idea, but just the leaving of votive offerings by the people on the trees. Where you'll see, I've seen many instances of it, people will hang offerings, so rosary beads or rags or medals or coins or baby soothers or bits of tissue, anything, they'll hang them on these trees as a kind of physical emblem or symbol of their hopes and prayers and wishes and so on. So there's a huge resonance that builds up at these sites. And
people also take bits away. Although it seems a bit counterintuitive that you're not meant to harm it, but in one of the pieces I read, immigrants who were leaving traditionally used to take a chip or something from these sacred trees as they were leaving to go to England or America.
Where on disaster would ensue, no doubt.
And well, touch wood that they lived long and happy lives, Jonny.
Yes, of course.
I will be the optimist. But yeah, they would take, one of them was in, where was it? Doohan in County Kilkenny, St Leonard's Street, and they used to take sprigs or chips from the tree. Really beautiful idea.
A.T. Lucas mentions a tree called Tubber and Villa, the well of the Billa, the well of the sacred tree, in Kerry, and he gives an account from the mid-19th century, in the 1800s, and he describes this tree growing beside this holy well, and he says, it's at the old ruined church of Kilcrahan on the mountainside and commanding an exquisite view. Near it is an extremely curious stone cell with a well dedicated to Saint Crahan, over which grows a gigantic ash tree, said to be the largest in Ireland, in which I readily believe. This tree is hung with innumerable coloured rags placed by the pilgrims who visit the well. A large patron, that means a pattern day, a day when the public would visit this place in their droves, the feast day of the saint, was held there annually on July 30th, but by 1945 the tree had fallen. This is A.T. Lucas talking now. And he says, when the writer visited the place a few years ago, the rotting trunk of the Billa still lay untouched on the ground, and pilgrim offerings of pennies were stuck in a split in it that showed its sanctity persisted even in its decay. So it's a very, very, where you have a holy well, you will have a holy tree, a holy bush that grows beside it. It's really, really common part of that tradition.
And they share as you said, the sanctity or the properties of the well.
They would never ever be desecrated or interfered with or interrupted in any way.
Can I there's a nice one here of St Bernard's Well in Woodtown in County Louth. Did you read this one? I just thought it was a very colourful description where A.T. Lucas relates that a legend exists where a neighbour brought a disabled person to the well in a wheelbarrow. And they were cured after bathing his limbs in the water, and the barrow was left as a thanks offering beside the well. And 2 trees grew from the handles of the barrow, and the leaves which they bore were never the same in 2 successive years. So they'd be oak one year, ash the next, and what did he say? And elm the following, and so on in cycle. A miraculous diversity reminiscent of the crops of apples, acorns, and hazelnuts borne by O Muna, which is one of, as we mentioned at the very beginning, one of the 4 legendary ancient trees of Ireland that was kind of categorised as having different produce each year, so that it could have the characteristics of an oak this year, of the ash next year, the elm the year after. So this legend has kind of picked up on these motifs and echoes it now into the 19th century.
That's amazing.
Isn't it interesting?
Talking on the topic of, say, holy wells and trees attached to them, the idea similarly, in tradition that Lucas mentions and that we see in the archive here, relates certain trees to the world of the dead. And in a social sense, say the billow or the sacred tree or a standing tree at a crossroads, that the funeral cortege would often have to stop at these trees. So as the deceased was being brought to be buried by the community, that they would often stop, that they would lay the coffin down, and they would pray at the site. We have an account here from County Offaly, a piece here from County Offaly in 1837, and it describes this practice of trees that were associated with funerals. It says, near Kennelly Church in Kings County there is an ash celebrated for its great dimensions and for certain religious ceremonies which have for many years been observed respecting it. The lower people, when passing by with a funeral, lay the corpse down for a few minutes, say a prayer, and then throw a stone to increase the number, which had been accumulating for ages around the root. The circumference of this tree is nearly 22 feet. You mentioned something yesterday, the leaving of wooden crosses at trees, and this is the death cairn, the death heap. It was an insult in Irish was that I wouldn't throw a stone on your death cairn, on your death heap.
It's very true.
There were heaps on the side of the road where a person had died maybe, and when you would pass you would throw a stone on that, and they would eventually turn these enormous mounds.
They would grow with each year, so you had stones and you had crosses, which was very interesting for us reading this, because we actually had a researcher in recently speaking about this tradition in Wexford, that she still remembered it. And now it was quite serendipitous that we came across it. But here A.T. Lucas describes it, where are we? Up to comparatively recent times, trees marked some of the points for funeral roundabouts at the following places in County Dublin, in Chapelizid, Palmersdown and Rathcoole. At every funeral in Cong, County Mayo, a relative of the deceased adds a little wooden cross to a pile of similar crosses from previous funerals, there being a pile on each of the 3 roads approaching the village. On the eastern road, the crosses are placed on a wall under the ash tree. The custom of bringing small wooden crosses to funerals was also widely observed in County Wexford, and this is where our researcher was from. And a description from 1894 says the following: at the crossroads nearest the cemetery there is always a hawthorn tree, at the foot of which the procession pauses, and the cross-bearers left their crosses to its branches, where they fix them and leave them. In some places the tree has fallen beneath its weight of crosses, but its roots remain, or at all events the memory of the place where it grew, and so the practice is continued, and the crosses are thrust in a heap lying upon one another, till a mound often 8 or 10 feet high may be seen.
Amazing. The idea, even of these memorials that were left, there's the mention of the monument trees as well, that are sometimes to the unbaptized dead, or the children who were aborted, or people who died maybe sometimes in a accidentally in a spot a tree was planted. I mean, the idea sometimes of planting a tree in honour of a dead person is a common thing nowadays.
Very much so.
But there's a mention here about the monument trees. This is by Canon O'Hanlon, who wrote under the pseudonym Laginiensis. In 1870, he says that monument bushes, so-called, are found for the most part in the centre of road crossings, and that unbaptised children and abortions are generally buried under them. The reason for that is that because these children are outside the spiritual bounds of the community, they can't be buried in consecrated ground. So they were left in these other places, or ditches, or crossroads, or high water marks, or holes in walls and stuff like this, or the west-facing wall of a church or cemetery or whatever. But the idea there is profanation it was profane to destroy them or to remove any of their branches. Is a common thing. The idea of, I suppose, the funeral memorial to the dead, basically. And I'm going to play a beautiful piece of music, or a beautiful song from Landis. This is from their album Bleaching Bones, The Trees Go Tall. I have no bias here, Claire. My missus is in this band.
But it's amazing, though. Their beautiful voice. I think it just shows you the artistry of the human voice.
And this, I suppose, it just links into the idea of kind of death and the tree that kind of carries on as a symbol after death, basically.
I love their themes.
Yes, cheery, to say the least. Okay, that's Landis from Bleaching Bones, The Trees Go Tall. We'll put a link to the people's descriptions and things that if people want to find out more about
and actually do listen to it, because it's just so haunting. But I just love just what they can do is incredible. It's so peaceful to listen to them, actually.
It is, despite the unquiet nature of the songs. It is fantastic stuff. To begin to the last kind of subject that we should look at, I suppose, features trees and the idea of the otherworld. And a particularly common idea that we find time and again, and we have a few tape recordings on this, is the idea that the fairies often live in trees on the Rath, on the Liss, on the fairy fort. but often the idea that the tree not planted by a human hand, I suppose, it's treated with certain reverence, a certain trepidation, a certain degree of fear, indeed, and that these trees weren't cut down; they were just left alone. You certainly wouldn't cut them, and then if you did, there'd be
Repercussions.
There'd be repercussions and retribution. Your cattle might die, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go back to a tape by Dahio Hogan. Apologies to listeners, this tape was dubbed at the wrong speed when it was digitized, so I had to muck around with it to try and slow it down. So Dahi sounds like he's inhaled a helium balloon, but you can understand that what's being described, at least. So this piece is from Mrs. Sarah Meany from Borrisokane, County Tipperary, and it was recorded in 1979. And it describes how when one person, a family member, cut a piece of a fairy bush on a fairy fort, that they suffered. That they were blinded in one eye, basically. So, here we are.
Did you ever hear much about the fairies around your place? Was there any traditions about them?
Yes, there was about the forts, that should never cut a bush in a fort. And an old cousin of mine, an old bachelor, they had a fort on their farm.
Yeah.
In a place called Lisbryan. You could understand there were plenty of lisses around there. And this fort, he insisted on cutting down some bushes out of it. And his sister alleged it was a curse. A thorn got in his eye and he lost the sight of the eye.
So, again, this idea common enough that you cut the tree, you'll suffer some sort of damage. This person is going to be blinded. This is a piece of, Hugh McPadden and his wife, Darius County Cavan, and they're basically describing the blackthorn tree and supernatural associations with it.
Was there legends or superstition attached to the blackthorn, the fairy tree? I think there was. It was used by the ancient Druids. And John McCormick wrote something the singer wrote something in a verse about the fairy tree around Claheen. It was a place in the County Tipperary where there was a great precipice, and very few ever passed that place without getting trouble with the car, if the car didn't overturn or something, and very dangerous. But I think the fairy tree always was the blackthorn, what the shillelaghs made from.
I think that's right.
We caught them in the fairy bushes at home.
I think so. I think in the north of it. I remember one in the glen, and it was even a white bird. The cattle used to shelter under it, but you didn't touch it.
You didn't touch it, no. Oh, we wouldn't burn a branch in our land, no. No, and even if it broke off,
we wouldn't leave it alone.
Leave it.
And I think it grew nowhere, only in Ireland.
Maybe that's
I wonder did it grow in Scotland?
No, I never heard of it grow there.
So, there's a kind of thing that you get time and again is just the reverence with which parts of the natural world were held by our forebears. As a kind of, if you look at things in a purely kind of materialist frame or perspective, all spaces are equally meaningless. You know what I mean? And everything's just whatever, just bulldoze that and remove that. Yeah. It doesn't have a name. There's nothing particular or special about it. But that's not the traditional view at all. And it's something that comes through again and again and again. The idea of the trepidation, basically, that's attached to these sites. There's a reference again to this idea of the tree, particularly the tree not planted by a human hand. And there's reference here from County Antrim in 1859, and it describes an ash tree that's growing by the edge of a stream, but the farmer won't touch it and won't even take kind of fuel from it or anything like that. It says, in the next field there's an ash tree standing alone at the edge of a stream and is thought to be of supernatural origin. The consequence is that it is treated with the utmost reverence by the small farmer in whose land it is growing. It is even thought unsafe to cut a rod from it, stories being told of calamities befalling persons who had been so daring as to commit such an act. The grass around it is carefully shorn, and when brought home a strict examination of it is made to discover if any twig has been cut in the process and carried away unwittingly from the sacred plant. And in cases where this has happened, I have known the twig taken back again and laid with due respect and caution beside the parent stem. Those trees not planted by human hand are regarded as being auspicious sites which must be treated with care. It's just, again, that's something that's not disappeared entirely today for all of
the modernity that we claim.
Well, yeah. These things still exist in some ways. That people still they refuse to go near and to interrupt with these things or to interfere with them in any way. Another piece to this is an account from Michael J. Murphy. This is recorded in Fermanagh in 1966, And this describes 7 white thorns that were cut down, and this man then has 7 of his cattle are killed.
John Lynch out there cut a 4th, just beside his own house in Corrinewa. And I heard him, like, this is true, he told it himself. He cut a 4th. I cut all the trees down, you know, knocked them all down. And there was 7 lonely bushes in it. And every year he lost 7 cows, and he didn't know what to do. And somebody told him to transplant, to get young white thorns and put them in the place where he cut the other ones out of. And he did it. And he never lost any more cows. Now that's Corrinewa.
That's beside you here,
just over there.
Corrinewa.
So, again, you do the 7 white thorns that are cut, and then the 7 cattle that die. So, rack and ruin.
Honestly, we're a cheery bunch, the Irish.
We are, but do not desecrate sacred land. You will experience great curses.
Yes, and it's the kind of the country code.
We didn't even mention the white thorn and satire and cursing from a height and so on. Next time.
That'll be next time. That's something to look forward to, folks.
I think the thing that's important to bear in mind is the interplay between the idea of sacred spaces in the natural world, hallowed spaces, venerable spaces, holy spaces and so on, that still linger among us, and that sometimes you need to peel back through layers of kind of, you know, snatches of words, place names, sentences, folk tradition, archaeological records and so on, to I suppose to get a sense of the meaning of some of these places and to reconnect them in ways. But the natural world is not just an empty kind of clanking void. It's there's much by way of spiritual and poetic and imaginative force at play there, which we should tap into and respect.
I agree. Well said.
To finish, as we move to finish, this poem I'm going to read, a piece from my favourite poet of all time, Anonymous. This is from the 12th century, and it goes back again to the frenzy of Sweeney. And this is Mad Sweeney, Sweden, the wild man of the forest. This is from around the 12th century, and he's describing the forest basically. And he says, "Little lanterned one, little belling one, melodious little bleater, sweet I think the lowing that you make in the glen. Homesickness for my little dwelling has come upon my mind, the calves in the plain, the deer on the moor. Oak, bushy, leafy, you are high above trees. Hazel bush, little branchy one, coffer of hazelnuts. Alder, you are not spiteful, lovely is your colour. You are not prickly where you are in the gap. Blackthorn, little thorny one, black little slow bush, watercress, little green topped one, on the brink of the blackbird's well. Saxifrage of the pathway, you are the sweetest of herbs. Cress, very green one, plant where the strawberry grows. Apple tree, little apple tree, violently everyone shakes you. Rowan, little berried one, lovely is your bloom. Bramble, little humped one, you do not grant fair terms. You do not cease tearing me till you are sated with blood. You are conspicuous in the graveyards. Little ivy, you are familiar in the dark wood. Holly, little shelter, door against the wind. Ash tree, baneful, weapon in the hand of a warrior. Birch, smooth, blessed, proud, melodious, lovely is each entangled branch at the top of your crest. Aspen as it trembles, from time to time I hear its leaves rustling, and I think it is the foray. If on my lonely journey I were to search the mountains of the dark earth, I would rather have a room for a single hut in Glen Mulcawn. Good is its clear blue water, good its clean stern wind, good its cress green watercress, better its deep brooklime. Good its pure ivy, good its bright merry willow, good its yewy yew, better its melodious birch.
Oh, that's incredible.
It's lovely, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Sibna the wild man in the forest.
There you go. Did you climb trees when you were younger?
Yes.
Did you? Yeah, me too. I don't know, do people climb trees now?
I hope so.
I hope so.
If not,
I feel very old sometimes when I'm talking to children. So I'm going to finish with a poem by, I kind of struggled as to find a nice poem about trees that kind of resonated with me. So you can go from, Patrick Kavanagh has some on the beech tree, you've got Can't Beat Yeats for the Song of Wandering Aengus, but I actually settled on one by A.E. Housman, who was an English writer, but he has one written in 1896, or at least published then, in his collection called A Shropshire Lad, and it's beautiful. It's called Loveliest of Trees, the
Lovely.
Cherry Now. And basically, by way of a little bit of context, it's simply a man speaking. He's, I think he's 20, but he's looking ahead and realizing that life is short and that he will only have a certain amount of time to enjoy the bloom of the trees and indeed the bloom of life, and so that he should make the most of every spring and every summer. So this is him speaking about the loveliest of trees, the cherry now. Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough, and stands about the woodland ride, wearing white for Eastertide. Now of my 70 years and 10, 20 will not come again, and take from 70 springs a score, it only leaves me 50 more. And since to look at things in bloom, 50 springs are little room, about the woodlands I will go, to see the cherry hung with snow. So,
beautiful.
Carpe diem.
Bless it,
and
carpe diem, yes indeed.
enjoy life while you have the sweet
Absolutely.
bloom of youth.
Hail. So, we're almost done. We're done pretty much. But I'd like to close with there's a lovely piece in the sound archive here. It's a recording from one Liz Ann Fitzpatrick. This woman is a native of County Laois in the Midlands of Ireland, and the recording was conducted by John Newman in Arbour Hill, where Liz Ann lived at that time in Dublin city centre in 1980. And at the time of this recording, Liz Ann is 80 years old. And so in this tape, she describes an apple tree which grew on her father's land, which he refused to cut down on account of his belief that it belonged to the fairies and the fact that it had been in the family for so many generations. He was in the middle of a cornfield, so people were kind of calling him an idiot and saying, cut it down, plough it, and he wouldn't do it. So the tree is in the family's land and he won't cut it. But Liz Ann carries on to describe listening with her brother to the fairies as they would sing in the fields at night, and how she understood them to be lovely little women who lived in the trees by day before going out and roving about the fields at night. To you out there listening, we send our gratitude for being with us, and to the late Liz Ann Fitzpatrick and the countless generations who have gone before us and who have gifted us the tree which bears upon its many flowering branches the fruits of memory, the gifts of song and story, of craft and custom, of proverb and of place name. We send our eternal thanks. Let us shelter well beneath these good branches, rooted in tradition as we reach for the heavens. See you next month. Slán.
And more heard you.
See, we have Tom in our house. My father had a great big tree in it.